Hello everyone. Welcome back. Sorry for... Anyway, we're now more or less back on time actually. It's not bad. We made up some lost time. So Antara is going to make a present. You all met Antara and know her. And obviously you also all know that Antara is an alumna of the AGW as well. She's been on 2 previous AGWs, both as a student and as a TA. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to have Antara talking. You know the title, you know her. I won't say much more other than congratulate her on her recent appointment at the faculty of Cambridge University. So, you know, another star is born. Antara, all yours.
Thank you so much, Akbar. It really is a pleasure to be back here, and it's really deja vu. I was sort of debating which of my projects I should present, and then it sort of came to me in a moment of clarity that the project that I am going to be presenting today was actually first presented at the AGW a few years ago when field work was just at a very indicative stage. So this is a wonderful opportunity to be able to sort of come back and flesh the picture out, so to speak. So my talk this afternoon is called Revisiting Institutional Theory Evidence from Land Titling in Microfinance Programs. And essentially what I'm going to try and do over the course of the next hour or so, to leave a good half hour for discussion, is try to make the case that the current paradigms of institutional theory that we have available are woefully inadequate, particularly in explaining the empirical realities of the developing world. So the structure of the presentation is very straightforward. I'm going to begin by presenting the theory as it currently stands. I'm then going to go into a fairly in-depth discussion of my empirical case studies. I'm going to look at my case studies for land titling and microfinance on 2 domains. First, I'm going to look at program outcomes. But I should mention that the program outcomes or program impact is not the focus of my study. But I will look at them drawing on broader sort of large-scale studies of this in both efficiency and equity terms. And then I'll look at what to me is of interest as a legal scholar, which is the institutional learning effects from these 2 programs. I'll then proceed to analyze the results that I report from fieldwork. I'll analyze the program outcomes in terms of the static analysis and the trajectories of institutional evolution in terms of the dynamic analysis. And finally, I'll attempt to sort of complete the loop by returning to theory and demonstrating the inadequacy of the current paradigms to explain the complexities of the case studies. Okay, so starting off with theoretical background, and to limit the scope, I'm sort of going to attempt to identify now the 3 main strands of theory in terms of how lawyers and economists in particular think about the relationship between institutions and economic growth or development. And I identified 3 main strands. So the first of these strands is what I call classical law and development. And this is constituted by a variety of different sources, but the 2 main sources, I think, are the law and society approach and the critical legal theory approach. Now, I'm extremely sympathetic personally to the claims of the law and development approach, but for reasons that Trubeck and Galanter in their 1974 article on law and development discuss beautifully, law and development started out essentially as an attempt by the American government to export its legal systems to the developing world via USAID and various other agencies, and they sort of appointed scholars as adjuncts to this movement. But the problem is that the scholars, once they started to become more sort of critical about their own subject, themselves sort of brought about the collapse of the movement. So this is what Trubeck and Galanter describe as law and development being in a constant state of self-estrangement. But as a result of this, the law and development strain of writing with really, really important writers like Mark Galanter, David Trubeck, Stuart Macaulay, more recently David Kennedy, has not had the kind of influence that the other 2 strains that I'm just about to describe have. So I'm going to sort of set it aside, sadly, and focus more on the other 2 strains that I consider to be the more dominant strains. Okay, so the second strain is what I call the institutions orthodoxy, and this is by far the most influential of the 3 strains, and this is constituted by the law and economics perspective, so contributions of people like Coase, new institutional economics, and insights from North and others. But most poisonously of all, what has come to be known in some strands of the literature as the rule of law orthodoxy. So this is the attempt of a new generation of sort of institutional scholars, primarily economists, to apply the broader theoretical findings of law and economics and new institutional economics, particularly to the developing world. And here I'm talking about work by people like Asimov, Johnson Robinson, and André Schleifer. And of course, the World Bank has jumped onto this bandwagon with great gusto and has funded a large number of these rule of law exporting programs, as well as scholarly programs that attempt to measure the rule of law through measures like the World Governance Indicators. Okay, so the third strain, and is it okay if we do questions at the end? Unless it's a clarificatory question.
Yeah, just clarification.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know where the legal origins stories fit in this framework.
Oh, very much within the orthodox perspective, very much within this, the institution's orthodoxy and the rule of law orthodoxy, which sort of, the legal origins literature, of course, being the one that attributes current states of economic growth to historical institutions. And Schleifer is one of the major authors of these papers. So, yeah, very much in the second box in there. Right. So the third of the perspectives, and where I would sort of roughly situate myself, is what I call the emergent perspectives. Now, this isn't, as yet, a really cohesive point of view or a really sort of coherent refutation, in some senses, to the law and economics perspective, but is constituted by a series of interventions by legal scholars and economists and sociologists and others that are sort of raising objections to various aspects of the institution's orthodoxy and the great influence that it's had. So one of the important strains here is the idea in both the systems theory literature within law and the literature on legal transplants on the idea of law as a cognitive institution. So this is making the shift from seeing legal systems as entirely sort of mechanistic institutional structures to being something that needs to be cognitively decipherable to the agents within the system. The second set of objections come from what I call the good economists, which several of whom, most of whom are probably seated in this room. And this is an attack on law and economics from a different standpoint, and this is from the standpoint of critiquing the extent to which the law and economics perspective gets the interpretation of how markets function wrong, essentially, and thereby discrediting their follow-on assumptions about what kinds of institutions will stimulate its proper functioning. Finally, within this perspective, there are two particular strains that I'd like to draw your attention to. One is a strain that started with Robert Putnam but has now become quite mainstreamed into economic theory, which is the social capital approach, which has helped economists to recognize the economic value of things like trust, social norms, networks, this sort of thing. And the second is the seminal contributions of the late Eleanor Ostrom, who in her work on common pool resources was able to demonstrate that informal solutions to collective action problems can really be a lot more effective than we've traditionally given them credit for. Okay, so now what I'm going to try and do is demonstrate what the key theoretical differences are in the underpinnings of the institution's orthodoxy and the emergent perspectives. And the way that I sort of analyze this is as follows. The institution's orthodoxy is characterized by taking a fundamentally Hayekian view of the market. So the market is, on this view, largely a spontaneous order that works best when it's able to pool information through the price mechanism, and works best when it's interfered with least. So on this view, markets are something that are self-regulating, and any kind of other extraneous regulations are an impediment to the functioning of markets. And this allows this perspective within its own logic to perceive institutions as something that are exogenous, or something that can be imposed from without, rather than something that is inherent in a broader system. And on the basis of this, they come up with a very nice, clean prescription for what they think are the only two sets of institutions that you need for markets to function properly. And this is the protection of property and the enforcement of contracts, and that both these things should happen through a formal legal system rather than by informal means. Now, the difference with the emergent perspectives, and these are a broad, as I said, amalgam of different kinds of perspectives, but what they have in common is that they see markets in Polanyian terms. So on this view, markets are embedded fundamentally in society, and this embedded view means that institutions become endogenous to the entire system. So on this view, obviously things like trust, social norms, social capital, these sorts of things become a lot more important. Okay, so to flip it around, what I'm essentially, my question can be rephrased as follows. You all know what the collective action problem is. It's what gets us from there to there. And the question that I'm asking is, what are the relative roles that formal and informal systems play in solving collective action problems, particularly in the developing world? So the orthodoxy has already answered this question, and their answer to this question is in terms of this man. They think that you have to have formal court systems, the apparatus of a Western-style legal system for the economy to function. And this is my first question, so is a formal Western-style legal system essential for economic growth? And the second question that I want to probe is, what is the relationship between these two different types of systems that we've seen theorized? Are they really different, disparate systems, or are they both parts of a larger whole instead? Okay.
So that's a nice picture of orthodox guy.
I knew my audience, and I knew to fly in this audience. Not too inaccurate, I think, if you've been in enough courtrooms. Right, so I explored the answers to these questions through the prism of a pair of comparative case studies. And these case studies are interesting because they have a really nice symmetry to them. They're both access to credit programs in the context of the developing world, so they both attempt to sort of alleviate poverty in the developing world through providing access to credit to the poor, but they adopt completely different institutional mechanisms for the delivery of credit. So the first of my case studies, the Hernando de Soto land titling program in Peru, is the poster boy of the formalist model. So the assumption here is that the poor are not being able to access credit through formal banks because the inability to offer collateral. So the idea here is that if you title the land that the poor already informally occupy in their names, they'll be able to offer these documents to the banks and be able to access credit. So that little piece of paper there is going to change the entire story as far as De Soto is concerned. This, in contrast with the microfinance model, which started in Bangladesh, associated with Mohammed Yunus, but of course now has spread everywhere, which deals with exactly the same problem, the inability of the poor to access credit, but provides a completely different solution. It provides loans directly to the poor without collateral or formal legal contracts, on the basis of an alternative mechanism that there is now some amount of dispute about, and we'll talk about this in a second. Okay, now methodology. So I should say right up front that I'm not an economist. I come to this as a legal theorist. And from the perspective of legal theorists, what is interesting for me about these case studies is how empirics inform legal design. So this is expressly an exercise in evaluative legal analysis, primarily with a view to understanding this linkage, how theory leads to institutional design, how institutional design is implemented. Ooh, my N has got a bit displaced there. And then how implementation then feeds back into theory. So I'm expressly adopting a case study methodology based primarily on qualitative research. So I conducted 100 interviews across 8 months in both countries with policymakers and other strategically chosen key actors to sort of get the distillate of their experiences in implementing these programs. Of course, I draw on a wide variety of other sources, large-scale quantitative studies, archival material, newspaper articles, participant and non-participant observation, but I consider the interviews really to be the key source of my primary data. I should also mention that this study is expressly comparative. I'm not purporting to provide a definitive statement on the absolute performance of the programs, or definitively which program performs in superior terms in terms of program outcomes, but rather to look at them in comparative perspective vis-a-vis institutional learning. And actually, this is the first study to systematically compare the two programs. And finally, I mean, it follows from this that the results are not generalizable in the sense that a large-scale quantitative study might be. So I've spent a lot of time telling you what it doesn't do, but what it does do is provide a level of depth and understanding of context that you miss out in the quantitative studies. And this is very much an attempt at sort of seeing the world in a grain of sand, that type of approach in terms of fleshing out some of what Ostrom has called the institutional detail that is so important to filling out the grand theories of institutions that are so popular in development today. Okay, so looking first at the program outcomes, I look at the performance of the two programs in both efficiency and equity terms. In efficiency terms, I look at their efficiency as systems of contract enforcement, and I look in particular at two dimensions of this, so the design of the contract, or whether it's successful in increasing credit access. And then in terms of enforcement, and this is measured, of course, by whether loans are actually repaid or not. In equity terms, I look at two sets of variables. I look at economic variables of instrumental normative value, and then I look at welfare variables of inherent normative value. Okay, so looking first at the efficiency of the two models, and starting with the land titling model, the design innovation of this model is clearly to attempt to use the availability of collateral to change, to sort of get banks to enter into lending contracts with the poor where they were in the past deterred from doing so. But despite the fact that the Peruvian land titling program is now about 15 years old, and over 4 million titles have been distributed in Peru alone, and Fernando de Soto's center is advising 40, 50 governments all over the world on the program. All independent assessments of the program find that there has been no substantial increase in access to credit. Okay, so why is this happening? There are a number of potential reasons. The first is that collateral may not really be the key problem. Lending in much of the developed world, and certainly the developing world, is based on things like future cash flows. So if income is actually much more important than the availability of collateral. Secondly, even if collateral were important, the value of the land holdings that we're talking about here are so low, especially compared with what the costs would be to the bank of foreclosing, that it renders the availability of collateral almost systematically sort of irrelevant or insignificant. The third is, of course, that land markets are highly imperfect or sometimes just completely absent. So this is a completely non-trivial assumption, again, on which the program is based. And the fourth is, from the demand side, excessive rigidity. It's very sort of intimidating for poor people living in Peruvian slums to enter into these very technical, formal contracts with the bank. Okay, so in enforcement terms, we don't really get to see how the model would be enforced because lending isn't increasing substantially, so this is partly a hypothetical discussion. But just working with it for the moment, the enforcement model that is adopted by the land titling program is what the literature has referred to as the external enforcement model. So the contract is between party A, the bank, and party B, the borrower. But the responsibility for enforcing the contract is vested in party C, in this case, the state. Now, in the context of the developing world and the track record that formal legal systems have, it is an absolutely non-trivial assumption to take for granted the state's legal capacity to enforce these contracts. It is a costly mechanism of enforcement in both information and monetary terms, where there is, even if an attempt were to be made to actually enforce the contract, there might be a huge problem of a legitimacy deficit. In terms of banks, in terms of courts upholding very, very unpopular decisions to foreclose land holdings of very poor people. And moreover, the main goal of the law and economics paradigm is that institutions should introduce certainty in transactions. But if you have a situation where a formal system is introduced that doesn't effectively displace the pre-existing systems, it can actually increase uncertainty because you have a coexistence of these, and a dualism of these institutional mechanisms. So on the whole, we see that in efficiency terms, the land titling program doesn't perform very well in either design or enforcement terms, and this is rooted fundamentally in something of a misunderstanding of both how the markets and legal systems in the developing world function. The microfinance program, on the other hand, wins out precisely because of its innovativeness and its ability to engage with the realities of the context in which it operates. So in design terms, the innovation of the model is to remove barriers of access, so there's no collateral required, there are no formal contracts required, and Grameen Bank in Bangladesh alone has entered into 9 million lending contracts. Estimates for the number of microfinance borrowers worldwide now put the number at something close to 1 billion, which is a really huge number. So obviously it's been extremely, extremely effective in inducing people to enter into these lending contracts. And the flexibility and nuance that these implicit contracts provide has been actively helpful even in economic terms in certain instances, in terms of being able to renegotiate contracts if there are payment difficulties or something of this sort. Okay, so a large part of the success of microfinance lies in the very, very interesting enforcement mechanism that it's been able to adopt. Now, what is clear is that the enforcement mechanism that microfinance adopts is a lot more credible in the context of the developing world than being taken to court. It is something that is much more real for a woman in a Bangladeshi village than the idea of sort of being taken by the MFI to court in Dhaka. But there is some debate at this point about what exactly that mechanism is. For a long time, it was believed that the key mechanism of enforcement in microfinance was peer monitoring. And this started, of course, with an article that Joe wrote in 1990. And this was this was very much the key explanation of how microfinance functioned in its early years. So as you know, loans were made to groups of 4 or 5 women under the joint liability paradigm, and in theory, until one borrower paid back, the next one couldn't get a loan. And this worked very, very well. And the key mechanism, I think, by which this worked is that it greatly reduced the information costs of monitoring. So what it meant is that the MFI was able to not have to monitor itself, but could delegate that monitoring to the people in the village and the group who had this, who if you're living next door to the other borrower in your group, you know implicitly whether she's using the loan for the purposes that she took it for, all these sorts of things. So the information advantages were huge in enforcing this. Interestingly, most MFIs switched out of group lending to individual lending. And the repayment rates remained extremely high. And the way that much of the economic literature has analyzed this is in terms of the sort of repeat gain paradigm, where you repay so that you're able to get the loan in the next time period. Joe and I are now working on a paper where we're sort of putting forward the idea that there may be a third explanation to the success of the enforcement mechanism, and this is in terms of positive norm creation. That as borrowers are members of the bank for a long period, they get acculturated into the payment routine. And there's sort of a trust, a reciprocal relationship of trust that develops between the MFI and the borrower that sustains and really smooths out its functioning in the longer run. The final explanation, and unfortunately the most cynical for why enforcement may have worked, is the use of coercion. And while there is some evidence of the use of coercion in MFI practice, it's unclear exactly what the magnitude is, but I think it's safe to say that it wasn't the key enforcement mechanism for the bulk of the operation of the microfinance experiment. But anyhow, through a combination of these mechanisms, microfinance has been able to retain repayment rates. They claim in the range of 98%, but even if one discounts it substantially and revises it down to 80%, that's still a remarkable, remarkable institutional achievement in what is otherwise a very institutionally dysfunctional region. Yeah.
So I just had a question. So from my understanding, there's a lot of heterogeneity in types of microfinance. So now there's a lot of micro lending by big banks, and enforcement mechanisms are actually loan officers. It looks much more like a model that's not community-based. And also that along with those different models, that there's also a lot of heterogeneity and what type?
Right. So I'm basing this on the case study that I conducted, which we should talk about that more in the discussion, and that's really, really important to talk about. I mean, I'll bleed into the changes in microfinance in any case. But yeah, I'm talking about the classic microfinance model, old-style BRAC, Grameen, Bangladeshi microfinance. And yeah, and it's changed. The story's changed a lot since then. But yeah, yeah. So this is Grameen and its ilk. Right, so just to as a final point on the enforcement mechanism, to give you a flavor for what people on the ground were saying, one of my key interviewees, who's the chairman of one of the major microfinance regulatory authorities, politically impacted tangentially via the economic variables. In terms of economic variables, there is some evidence of positive results. There is undoubtedly increase in formal property ownership by the poor. As I said, 4 million land titles have been distributed in Peru alone. There is some evidence of increased household investment as a result of this. There's a third result by Erica Field at Harvard that became very prominent that finds that land titling led to increased labor force participation rates. So her hypothesis was that people did not need to stay home to guard their property anymore and were able to go out and work. This, however, encountered a great deal of skepticism in the field. There are many sort of settlements outside of here in Bangalore, and you'll see that although they're not formalized, people are not actually having to stay at home to guard their property, because a lot of these settlements have existed for a very long time and are really quite settled. And in terms of methodology, Tim Mitchell at Columbia has written a very good article sort of questioning the methodology that she uses in her papers. So I think this result needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. In terms of welfare variables, there isn't much evidence of it impacting basic variables that we're interested in, like education, health, nutritional status. The gender impacts are ambiguous. In some cases, titling is in favor of women, and this means that the women do formally own the property, but it's unclear what the net effects are, because in some of these cases, although titling is formalized in the woman's name, what it does do is erode systems of customary justice and other arrangements that were actually more equitable for the women. Other problems are that it increases the threat of landlessness. Arjun just peeked in and has disappeared again, but I was having an interesting conversation with him about how there's an analogy here with organ donations. And from a purely economics point of view, giving a person the freedom to sell their land is a good thing, but it's a little bit, there's an analogy with organ donation in that once you lose it, it's irreversible. And some amount of paternalism here might be in order. And of course, as with any other bureaucratic program in the developing world context, it's vulnerable, and there is much evidence of this actually happening, of the benefits actually being deliberately appropriated by elites. Okay, so not a great performance in equity terms either. On the microfinance front, microfinance has adopted, it started out just as lending, but has quickly transformed into what people on the ground call a microfinance plus approach. So it's a much more sort of holistic approach to development, impacting not only economic variables, but directly impacting welfare variables as well. In terms of the economic variables, there's been, microfinance has led to a substantial increase in property ownership. In particular, mortgages are often given to women borrowers. There's an increase in investment in business assets and of various other kinds. Microfinance directly funds various kinds of employment-generating activities. There's some evidence of increasing income. However, in terms of impacts on macro-level impacts on poverty, the results are a little bit more ambiguous. Strangely, there hasn't been a good study of the poverty impacts of microfinance done since, in Bangladesh at least, since Kantkar's study in 1998, which found that the impact on poverty was as little as a reduction by 1% a year. And policymakers that I spoke to in Bangladesh did express concern about the case for microfinance alleviating poverty having been oversold. And I think it's clear now that it's not going to be the one-stop shop for eliminating poverty that it has been touting itself as. But nonetheless, in terms of economic variables, a fairly positive impact. And in terms of welfare variables, health, education, nutritional status, the MFIs are increasingly diversifying through their social businesses into directly impacting these sectors. Not to mention the spillover effects from the improvement in the economic variables. But in gender terms and in terms of agency empowerment, it's really had an extremely positive effect. So MFIs lend almost primarily to women. So Grameen, for instance, 97% of its borrowers are women. And this has led to palpable effects with everyone that I spoke to talked about the fact that before microfinance, you didn't even see women walking around outside the house. So basic indices like women's mobility, and of course, there are many studies about increased contraception use and other positive effects.
Just a clarification. On the mixed evidence poverty reduction, the poverty reduction here is defined as some increase in monetary income.
No, this is macro level poverty. This is the impact of microfinance on aggregate poverty. Yes.
I see. So that's very complicated.
Which is not right.
We will get to that.
And given how wide coverage is, the projection is that there should have been more of a systemic effect that we see, but we're not seeing that, and it's a little bit of a mystery why. Yeah. Although household income has increased, and there have been sort of welfare benefits at that level. Okay, right. So, just to sum up the story so far, or on a static analysis, so if you took a sort of snapshot of the land titling program at this moment in time and a snapshot of microfinance at this moment in time, one saw that both in terms of performance outcomes and in terms of, so on both dimensions of performance outcomes, so efficiency and equity, it seemed that the microfinance program was performing better. Now, this flies in the face directly of the orthodox perspective, which would have predicted that the De Soto program would have far outperformed the microfinance program. And I think the case studies in this realm show us very clearly the limits of the orthodox and the formalist perspective in terms of how highly under-socialized they are and the very, very limited extent to which they are able to contend with informal institutions. Okay. But the story gets a little bit more complicated in the next set of things that we're about to discuss. Okay, so in institutional learning terms, looking first at the land titling program, all the major institutional stakeholders in the land titling program, whether it was at Hernando de Soto's Institute for Liberty and Democracy, the Peruvian government's land titling agency, COFOPRI, the Peruvian government's land registration agency, SUNARP, or the major funder of the Peruvian titling program, which is the World Bank. All of these agencies admitted to the failure of the program on their own terms. And they all also indicated that they attributed the failure to a fundamental sort of inability or a fundamental failure to engage with the context in which they were attempting to implement the program. But interestingly, far from abandoning the program, the feedback effect has been an attempt to redesign the program to situate the more formal aspects of it in the context in which it operates. So for instance, the ILD is explicitly abandoning its best practice paradigm and the idea of importing first best Western style institutions into the developing world. And in the advisory opinion that it gave to Tanzania, for instance, it worked a lot more with the contextual arrangements that pre-existed its intervention into Tanzania. COFOPRI was very, very, very explicit on this point. The head of COFOPRI, as you'll see in a minute from a quote that I'm going to present, talked at length about the importance of a culture of formalization rather than just a standalone titling program. And the World Bank that was the least least open about admitting its failures, even there from their practice, we see that they're not able to assume anymore that you'll hand over the title and everything else will follow. And in their practice, they're starting to introduce more and more sort of business training type programs so that the women who are titled, for instance, know what to do with the title. So this position is summed up, again, really well by one of my key interviewees from Peru who put it as follows: the problem with the law is the difference between the official and the real. 28,000 laws exist in Peru, but they are ineffective. Law in Peru has turned into an instrument of control rather than development. The problem of development is ultimately cultural. And I get some objections to the use of the word cultural here, but I think by cultural, he's not a native English speaker, so I think what he means by cultural here is social, that it needs to be embedded in the context. And just to sort of animate things for you, this is a picture that I took while on fieldwork of one of the titled properties. And you know, you get a sense that having a little piece of paper that tells you that you own this may not instantaneously, dramatically transform your life. Okay, so now turning to the microfinance experiment, the plot thickens here as well. So for about 30 years, and across a network of millions of borrowers, microfinance has functioned beautifully as a largely informal system. However, in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been some deep structural changes. Sorry, did you have a question?
Of landholding before it was implemented by World Bank, the land titles given to parents.
You mean the slum areas where titling mostly took place?
So they were sharecroppers now?
It's largely an urban program. There's been some amount of accession.
So if they are given titles to the area, mean that they can exploit that land for agricultural purposes, right? It's just for staying there. So there won't be any economic...
Just clarificatory questions.
Yeah. So there won't be economic benefits from having that land in their name, right? So that way, it's not a kind of...
Let me just... De Soto had this view that if you gave collateral, that there was all this wealth that was locked in, and that you would
dead capital.
And so in the agriculture, you'll be able to invest in agriculture. In the urban sector, you have all this entrepreneurship that was innate, and it would always flourish. So that was the idea. What was the name of the book? It was basically money.
Mystery of Capital.
Yeah.
The land value was very.
Well, there were two. The other part was the direct refutation.
It was sort of like having a home equity loan.
Capital that was in York. Right, so does that, yeah. Okay, so, yeah, looking at microfinance in the last few years, in the last 4 or 5 years in particular, there have been some deep structural shifts in the microfinance sector. And essentially, what happened is that the sector started to see, both in South Asia and globally, but more intensively in South Asia, it started to see an era of great irrational exuberance. So there was a huge number of new MFIs entered the arena to supply microcredit. And what started to happen is that there were several parallel MFIs or microfinance institutions operating in each village, leading to the phenomenon of what we called overlapping, which is that borrowers started to take loans from one bank to pay back another, and there's an analogy here with, of course, the subprime mortgage crisis, and started to get caught in a debt trap. So there was this huge oversupply of credit in this era of irrational exuberance happening, but scaling up was happening in other ways as well. So the more positive aspect of the scaling up experience was that the more established MFIs were diversifying more and more into what they called social businesses, so large-scale business enterprises that they were diverting their surpluses into, with a view to delivering low-cost commodities of various kinds to their poor borrowers. And as a corollary of this expansion, there were also a number of increasing incidents of fraudulence. In the case of Jubok in Bangladesh, sort of springs to mind here. But as a result of these various scaling up related phenomena, it became necessary for some sort of formal regulation to be introduced into the sector. And in Bangladesh, this was able to happen much more smoothly without the sort of catastrophic path that microfinance in India took thanks to SKS, where in addition to all of these, SKS was expanding far too rapidly just as an individual entity, and was also making the shift to the for-profit model. And of course, regulation in India had to be introduced in a very dramatic fashion, but what was happening in Bangladesh anticipated in some senses what was happening in India, and Bangladeshi microfinance sort of organically in some senses grew into this regime of a regulatory structure. So again, just to give you a bit of flavor for what was happening on the field, one of my very colorful interviewees in Bangladesh described the phenomenon as ilishma cheptil diye ilish mach bhaja, which those of you who understand Bengali will get. But what it essentially means is fish frying in its own fat. So that's what he described the microfinance industry as being. It just became something that got bloated up on its own sort of excesses. And putting it in slightly more conservative terms, the governor of Bangladesh Bank said, trust-based regulation works in the context of a small organization, but as an organization grows, you need a more formal regulatory framework. Microfinance in Bangladesh is suffering these transition issues. Okay, so we got a very clean result in some senses on the static analysis or looking at the program outcomes at a given moment in time, but when we look at the trajectories of institutional evolution of the two models, the story gets a lot more complex. On the one hand, we saw the failure of the formal system because of its inability to sort of root itself in the societal context in which it was based. But on the other hand, we saw that the informal solution is not a transcendental solution either, because the more successful an informal solution to a collective action problem is, the more likely it is to be replicated and scaled up, and the process of replication and scaling up inherent in that is something that seems to require a transition to the formal at some point. And I think of all the paradigms that I've seen, systems theory is the best in encapsulating this problem. And I think that the dynamic analysis sort of frames very nicely what I call the institutional conundrum, which is as follows. The law may be seen on the one hand as a means of capturing or encoding in a durable form that lends itself to replication, learning or information about successful strategies that emerge at the local level for solving collective action problems. So in one sense, formal institutions are a way of embedding in a way that lends it more permanence and allows itself to replication, successful informal institutions. But inherent in this process of formalization is a loss of responsiveness and the rigidities that are endemic to formal institutions. And so here we have something along the lines of a Fulanian double movement, where perhaps institutions need to be framed always within these two extremes and stay within these two bounds to be in equilibrium. But again, to close the loop, I've started out trying to make the case for revisiting the paradigms of institutional analysis that we have available to us due to its inability to contend with the empirical realities of the developing world as illustrated by the case studies. And we saw this clearly from the static analysis where, contrary to the predictions of the very, very influential orthodoxy, the informal microfinance model actually performed considerably better than the formalist model. And there may be interesting policy implications from this in terms of the sequencing of reforms. I think this may illustrate the fact that at earliest or intermediate even stages of development, informal, contextual, locally rooted interventions may be a lot more likely to succeed. However, the dynamic analysis illustrated that the escape into the social or the informal isn't the final solution either, because we saw a tendency of convergence between the two models, and there seems to be something inherent in the informal where, in the process of scaling up and being replicated, there is a need to transition more and more to a more formalized and legalized system. And so the emerging perspectives don't give us the full picture either. So to conclude, we see that the current theory really fails to contend with the empirical realities of the developing world. The orthodoxy was proven to be deeply flawed in terms of its ability to contend with what I call the inner logic of institutional evolution, or the fact that trajectories of institutional evolution are, in what you would call in your terms, highly path dependent, and highly dependent on history, sociology, culture, context, various sorts of things. And the orthodox perspective is highly, highly under-socialized in its representation of the interventions that are needed. But similarly, I think the key problem with the institutional theory that we currently have is the inability of either strain of literature to explain the interactive dynamics or the relationship between the formal and the informal. And we see from some of the more successful institutional examples around us in the developing world that really what a successful institutional structure does best is enable the formal skeletal structure and the norms that support it to work in tandem. And we need really to push forward our understanding of how these interactive dynamics work. Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Avanti first.
I really enjoyed this talk, and I guess I just have a couple of minor interventions which might not really take away. I'm convinced by the whole thing. One is that I think when you mention contributions of economic theory to institutions, it might be worth mentioning the new institutional economics, a la Sandbold and so on, that talk about how social preferences and social norms have a way of shaping behaviors to deal with incomplete contracts and how that could in turn shape economic outcomes. And my second comment was in terms of the outcomes, when you compare the efficiency outcomes of MFI and land titling, clearly, yes, absolutely by far, MFI is the better. Except I think the evidence, at least as far as I'm interested in issues of gender, particularly in relation to Grameen Bank, there have been a number of studies that show mixed results.
Right.
Like, yes, we did see an increase in women's mobility and increase in access to income, but also on the other hand, you know, there have been reported cases of how, you know, husbands or brothers or fathers would appropriate the loans and misuse that, but it's the women who were kind of responsible to pay back, which would kind of increase stress. And if they refuse to hand it over, that kind of created conflict within household and increased risk to violence and so on. So it's kind of a mixed bag of sorts. It's just...
Yeah, so on both points, I agree with you to add that to the theoretical overview that I provide. On the gender issue, I'm aware of studies by Malik and Rahman and various studies that have been done on MFIs in India as well, that sort of talk about how the shift to lending to women on the part of the bank was actually a prudential move because they found it easier to sort of get loans back from women than when they were lending to men, appropriation by husbands and brothers and this sort of thing. Interestingly, I'm sort of on the fence about whether I'm convinced by this study or not, but there's a pair of economists that have done a study on the welfare benefits even if the funds are appropriated by the man in the house, and they find that the net effects are positive for the woman. And I'm aware of these other effects, but I think on balance it would be fair to say that it's had a number of positive
Oh yeah,
effects.
totally. I just said
Including on status of women.
I think that's more mixed. So those the consensus is it's mixed.
Right. There are a few indicators, contraceptive mobility and in terms of growth. And there's some very, very positive anecdotal evidence of Grameen bank borrowers who've gone on to win elections and sort of be on the board of Grameen or win sort of state elections and that sort of thing. So it has had positive effects, although I completely concede that the effects are mixed.
Yeah, please.
Since using these two case studies to understand institutional design, my first question is particularly in the case of microfinance, you've identified the institution in question as being Grameen Bank, whereas possibly the institution that one should be studying is the social affinity group. And there's a reason I'm saying this. In India, for instance, after the collapse of, as you rightly said, SKS and all the rest of that, which was essentially this move of trying to move what evolved within the informal sector into regulated finance and capital. We now have a move through the National Rural Livelihood Mission that is being funded by the World Bank to take these institutions of groups of women at various stages of federation, so small self-help groups into federated groups, into cooperatives, and sort of reorient them towards livelihood creation rather than saving and borrowing. Okay? Which means there's a recognition that when we say microfinance was failed in India, SKS, the institution, rightly so, has been missed out, but the institutions of the poor that have been built based on this notion of affinity groups is now being used for other purposes. So my question is, since you're studying institution form, which one is the institution you should be looking at?
Right.
Grameen or the...
Thank you very much for that comment. That's really interesting, actually, because this is absolutely consistent with my hypothesis and also what the paper that you and I have been working on in terms of what the real legacy of MFI is. And this is an ongoing debate because it's been critiqued on the basis of not sort of alleviating poverty single-handedly, but I believe for a while now that what its real legacy is the changes is creating these norm structures, these community building efforts, and the leverage effects and the spillovers from the creation of a wide network of these at the base and what we can do with them. In response to your specific question about the unit of study, within the parameters of the time and resources that I had to do this study, an in-depth ethnography of the groups was not possible, although I would very much like to conduct that as a follow-up study, because that really is where the action is. But there is another justification for the unit that I chose, and that is that I'm interested in exploring how one can actually scale up from these smaller groups to a broader institutional structure, which to some extent, in a federalized way, Grameen and other MFIs were successful in doing. So the best way would be to study them at both ends and then study the linkages between them. So this is the first part of that three-part project.
Gabriela, and first Gabriela.
Here, De Soto, ridiculed just a little bit more. My question actually relates to your last point, a bit on scale, and also related to how you're understanding formal and informal. In a sense, if you look, there's a paper that came out from Amartya Sen after the crisis that really addressed the point of scale and trust, and how this has really changed over time. And I was wondering how you're identifying scale, because in a way you can look at scale horizontally, and growth, when you say you want to see this, that the motivation is for this to go to scale, that kind of scale can be still at a very small scale in the sort of mechanism of MFIs, or it can be formalized, i.e. regulated by larger institutions. So I'm wondering, which is it that motivates your study? Are you hoping to see this regulated and scaled up vertically, which I hope you don't, or are you looking at how we can take this to scale in a very different way from a horizontal perspective, which maintains the fundamental reasons why you yourself have pointed out there has been success and why many others have spoken about the development of trust and the sort of peer effects of what's good about MFI.
Thank you so much. That's really in details of the reference to the Sen article, because that would be really interesting for me to look at. So I'm going to answer this question. Well, actually, the two parts come together, so I'll just answer it in one go. So in terms of vertical or horizontal scales, my preference would be for horizontal scaling. We've seen it happen from, Grameen started out as a really tiny enterprise and was able to grow over a 30-year period into a network of 7, 8, 9 million borrowers. There's no reason in theory why that couldn't keep happening on a horizontal scale almost indefinitely. However, one sees in almost every context that there seems to be compulsion to scale up vertically as well. Whether this may be attributable to one of two things. One is that it may be that that's what's sort of saleable. So interestingly, whenever Yunus talks about Grameen, his selling point for microfinance is that it is going to put poverty in museums, which is clearly untrue, but also a problematic agenda to set.
Also, because selling to whom? He doesn't need to sell it to the poor women. I mean,
no, but in terms of the sort of so the point is that the compulsion for vertical scaling might be either extrinsic or intrinsic, and I'm not sure which one it is. In some senses, vertical scaling is valued a lot more in policy and by the traditional metrics that are used to measure success of programs, and it may be driven by that, but. I'm wondering, this is sort of, I don't have the answer to this yet, but I'm wondering if there is something sort of, what I call the inner logic of institutions, whether there's something inherent in the institutional process that beyond a point starts to sort of be corroded a little bit by the kinds of impulses, by the kinds of factors that we've seen corrode the Grameen experience very dramatically in India, but also in Bangladesh. And I mean, everyone that I spoke to on the ground talked about how it was really a very true and noble and sort of a boutique thing in the first 5 or 10 or 15 years of its operation. But in the attempt to sort of to broaden it, and I mean, even if it wasn't mass manufactured on quite the scale that it has ended up being, that there was something about it that was diluted or lost. And I'm wondering if there might be something intrinsic to the process of institutional evolution that leads to this. And I think it's an excellent question. I think the horizontal route is the preferable one, but is there something, but I'm not sure that the vertical route can be eliminated entirely, and this is something I'd like to investigate further.
So regarding when you measure the concept of equity, so you get an increase in property ownership, increase in income, investment, employment, and poverty. So in theoretical sense, maybe that is true, but how do you measure that things in terms of quantitative figures? Suppose you say that poverty reduced. This due to microfinance, the poverty is reduced. Maybe you can, in general sense, you can say these things. But how you establish that things? It's regarding methodology, how you collect, how you find that, how you prove that. The second thing is that when you're comparing with something, so you see maybe one is in positive direction and another is in negative direction. So when you are talking about the second one, this failure of this second one, so what are the factors responsible for that failure? So at least you should emphasize on that.
Right. Okay. So in terms of the answer to the first part, the measuring, I have relied on a wide variety. I mean, this is not a large-scale, economic style study. I have relied on a wide cross-section of data. And as I said right at the beginning, I only intend these to be indicative rather than definitive. But this is very much the picture that seems to emerge from a wide variety of sources. So I can't really speak to that question. In terms of the mechanisms for why this is occurring, I think I can speak to that a bit more, and that is, I think, the fundamental sort of mismatch between the institutions that are attempting to be transplanted and the context, without making any attempt to prepare the ground for those transplants to be sort of, to take root, so to speak. So when I talked about the failure of the land titling program to lead to an increase in access to credit, we talked about the many assumptions that it made about markets, how well markets functioned, the value of the collateral, whether it would be feasible for the bank to actually foreclose on these properties, and so on. So I mean, I think it's largely based on false assumptions about both markets and legal systems.
Walter and
In nature, I suppose. I've always been a little bit sceptical about the microfinance claim, and it just came up, so let me jump back one question about the vertical and horizontal scaling thing. I think there's a very good reason why these microfinance organizations need to scale vertically, not horizontally. That has to do with the repayment rate, the absurdly high repayment rate of 98%. It is my suspicion that there's a lot of evergreening going on. And if you evergreen on a fixed capital basis, you're stuck. So you have to expand vertically. You have to expand your portfolio of lendable funds, as it were, in order to keep up your incredibly high principal repayment rate. And that sort of forces you to either shut the fund down or expand vertically. And as you do not want to shut the fund down and want to keep the incredibly ridiculously high repayment rate, you have to go vertically.
So could you explain in a little bit more detail the mechanism of the vertical...
So on a $100 loan...
Can I just interject?
Yeah, sure.
So Kiva has Kiva, which is the online microlending, has a 99% repayment rate, and that's a huge horizontal scale.
Right.
Because you're assuming that there's no returns to the actual investment.
There can't be two
The implication essentially is that I mean, are you saying that the number is doctored, or that it's in some senses a self-sustaining number that they...
Well, the presumption would be that if you want to let your organization grow in any fast way, you would need to attract new capital, and that can either be done through interest payments on the loans, so the actual cash flows that are coming in, or by attracting new capital. And well, that's the point about scaling vertically. So you have a locked-in base of 100, and then you either grow via the interest rates, but if you keep evergreening the outstanding loans, you can only grow by the interest rates or by the cash flow payments that are coming in. And that might not be fast enough to be sellable. So in order to extend fresh loans, you have to attract new capital, which automatically means extending your capital base, which is another way of saying growing vertically.
Right. Well, we should talk about this a bit more afterwards. But I mean, my sense is that, as you said, Grameen Bank interest rates are extremely high.
Right.
And through that avenue, they're able
that might
to
solve it, yeah.
sustain. But I mean, again, I'm not speaking so much to the details of the financial practices of the Grameen. I mean, even if there is a large amount of doctoring and we revise the repayment rate down significantly, I think from an institutional point of view, if for anyone who has any background on what the agricultural bank loan repayment rates were, or anyone cognizant of the institutional dysfunctionality in the developing world would have to find the repayment rates that MFIs have reported remarkable, even if one revised the estimate downward significantly.
To start with, that all rural banks have low repayment rates, but
In the subcontinent.
Okay, here.
India.
Okay, no, but that's it. No, I was thinking when you were speaking about that maybe this conclusion about the role of the mix of informal and formal, which, by the way, the legal, I did the legal history, they say, support the view that you're trying to. Now, that somehow is through formality in the sense that even you can say that's true for many contract enforcement or contract fulfillment, really, of a larger character, even among major firms.
Right.
Okay?
Of course, yeah. As Stuart
So
Macaulay
it's
studied.
true also. So there is a tradition. Whenever a country have a tradition of fulfilling contracts informally, the legal system, in a sense, becomes less relevant.
Absolutely.
And it works better than the legal enforcement when you don't have that tradition.
Right.
Okay, that's again. But I was thinking that maybe there are other cases in which you cannot apply your framework, in which you really have to have legal changes and enforcement in order to drive change. And it occurred to me in several cases. I mean, gender equality issues, for example, or children protection, or historically, labor standards, were all cases in which I can hardly think that the informal mechanism is very effective.
Right, yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I'm not, okay, so this is more in the domain of the kinds of regulatory structures that are of economic importance. And even...
but these are made, labor standards are very economic. Even some gender equality
right, but
are very economic because it's no discrimination in the job market or,
right.
I guess protection of children may be a bit less economic.
Right, and so I was focusing a bit more on the domain of property, protection of property and enforcement of contracts and so on. And even there, I think that informal solutions will not be the transcendent solution. I think that it's difficult to envisage a viable scale of operation that completely eliminates the role for the formal. I think our focus needs to be on, I think that the informal may be the right starting point, and I think our focus needs to be on working out how to essay that transition, to build the momentum, as you say, to get to the point where the informal can sort of lead into the formal more organically. Where it comes to things like sort of social, gender and children's, protection of children's rights and so on, and I'm also sort of interested in the flip side of what I've been talking about, which is the role that formal regulations can play in seeding norms. And I'm on the market for examples where that has successfully happened, because that would be really nice to add to my list of case studies. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence, including in the country that we're currently in, is not very positive on that count. Another paper that I wrote talked about, listed the range of protections of women's rights in India. And we have almost everything that you could imagine is on the books, but it translates into very little. There's a lot of, the entire nation is focusing now on the rape case in Delhi, and the brutalities against women are mind-boggling and atrocious in this country, and they coexist completely unproblematically in some senses, but with both the formal regulations and the norms completely ignoring each other. So I would love to find a way of linking the two in the other direction, where legislation could have a purposive effect on changing norm systems. And I would really, genuinely love evidence of that, but I'm more optimistic about it going in the other direction. So slower shifts in norm systems that are then consolidated or codified into legislation that then underwrites that norm.
Can I just make a comment about that? One of the reasons that Yunus began was really that he wanted to intervene in the power structure of Bangladesh. And he didn't think he could do it through formal institutions. That the point was that his belief was that by giving access to credit, it would change the balance of power within the family, and would, through that informal mechanism, change the relationships that existed. And he's continued to in a way, try to use some of the power of these informal institutions to push for change. Another example, one of the things that he did was introduce mortgages, which were a little bit bigger than microloans for improving the house. But what he did is he insisted that before they give a mortgage, the house be put in the name of the woman. And in some of the Bangladesh, one of the traditional divorce would be you could say, I divorced you 3 times, and you were divorced. And the point that he wanted to make was, okay, you get divorced, and the husband has to leave the home. He becomes homeless. And it changes the economic power. Now, one of the interesting aspects that BRAC has done, which is the other major microcredit in Bangladesh, is that part of what they've done, and goes to the social capital, is that they have a very strong program on women's legal rights. So this is sort of, Bangladesh had a very good constitution, legal women's rights like India, but they were not implemented. And what they did is basically go into the villages and inform women of what their legal rights, and then actually provide legal services to make sure that they were enforced. And so it changes again, just even having access to those rights changes you might say, the bargaining power. And it's not that you actually have to resort to the rights, but it's that you have the right to, that you can resort to those. It changes the dynamics.
Yeah.
So I think it really is this interaction between the informal and the formal that becomes important. It's important to have the formal rights written down, but it's very hard for governments by themselves to say, we're going to implement them if there's not a broader, I don't know, say, social cohesion, societal impetus to implement it. And that's where you need work at the informal level to make it become part of part of the norms of society. And I think they're doing an actually very impressive job.
Just to supplement, Joe, what you're saying, Bangladesh is another country in terms of reducing gender disparities.
Yeah.
And total fertility rate in Bangladesh now down to replacement level. The male-female differential in education and health indicators is the narrowest in South Asia. It improved most in the last 20 years. So maternal mortality. So there's a lot of, at the aggregate level data, which suggests something's going on in Bangladesh, which is not happening in other.
Exactly.
And the question is, what is it, that other thing that's going on in Bangladesh?
And it's quite clear it's not the government.
So it suggests
It's not political maturity.
Exactly. No, so I think that changing economic realities is a much better way of changing social norms, and then using, as you were saying, those bases that MFIs have created, to then get the women in the groups to access their rights, rather than. I mean, the track record of legislation bringing about social change has not been a positive one, unfortunately. And we've tried.
There are examples. Civil rights legislation in the United States did bring about some changes, not as much as people might have hoped, but it's
labor standards have been effective. I mean, historically.
Do we have more questions?
So I also see an analogy with the literature on labor standards and enforcement of labor regulation. And what's interesting over there, that there are studies that sort of indicate that once introducing the formal laws, implementation was contingent on having some sort of local concentrated interest in sort of like unions or civil society organizations. And then once you had that in place, there was a sort of socialization, internalization of those norms. So the dynamic happened in the other way around.
Right.
So I guess my question to you would be like, would that fit within the analogy of cases that in the framework that you were sort of of the cases that you want to study, and which box would you situate sort of a dynamic of this nature?
Oh, absolutely. Direction from the informal to the formal. But I mean, I'm sure that, I mean, and I would be, in policy terms, very sort of positive if it could move in the other direction. But the key point here is that there needs to, and what you, in the cases that you talked about, the key point was that there was a transmission mechanism. Just having the law did not change reality. It was able to go through the avenue of a socially embedded institution that had traction in that society.
That's why I saw the analogy.
Exactly, exactly. So the key point is that you have to get these two elements interacting for any real change to be seen.
Yeah, thank you, Antara. We are eating into student discussion time. Joe last.
Oh,
Joe.
want to ask a question.
Just one
Is
more.
it
Just one more, I guess.
Well, I hate to eat into the student. There are presentations scheduled in the small group meeting. So unless it's something
You could do it
desperately,
one-on-one.
but they can talk separately and talk to each other.